All right, let's set the stage. The Viking Age didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the result of various factors brewing in Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These regions were characterized by rugged terrains, dense forests, and a scarcity of arable land. Such conditions made large-scale agriculture challenging, pushing communities to seek alternative means of sustenance. Enter the sea. The Scandinavians, being adept seafarers, turned to the waters for survival and prosperity. Their proximity to the North Sea and the Baltic Sea provided them with ample opportunities for fishing, trade, and exploration. Over time, they developed advanced shipbuilding techniques, leading to the creation of the iconic longships, sleek, fast, and capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers. But why did they start raiding? Several reasons come into play. Firstly, overpopulation in certain areas led to competition for limited resources. Secondly, the political landscape of Europe was fragmented, with many regions lacking strong centralized defenses. Monasteries in particular were wealthy, yet poorly defended, making them prime targets. Lastly, tales of riches and fertile lands abroad enticed many to seek fortunes beyond their homelands. The first recorded Viking raid occurred in 793 CE at the Lindisfarne Monastery in Northumbria, England. This brutal attack shocked the Christian world and marked the beginning of the Viking Age. News of the raid spread rapidly, and soon more Norsemen set sail, targeting coastal settlements across the British Isles and beyond. These early raids were swift and ruthless. Vikings would land unexpectedly, plunder valuables, and retreat before local forces could respond. Their mobility, combined with their formidable combat skills, made them a formidable threat. However, as time progressed, their objectives evolved from mere raiding to establishing settlements and integrating with local populations. It's essential to understand that the term Viking wasn't an ethnic identifier, but rather a profession. To go a Viking meant to embark on a voyage, often for raiding or trading purposes. Thus, not all Scandinavians were Vikings, but many participated in these expeditions at some point in their lives. In summary, the dawn of the Viking Age was a complex interplay of environmental challenges, technological advancements, and socio-political dynamics. Driven by necessity and ambition, the Norsemen ventured into the unknown, leaving an indelible mark on history. So, after that first shocking raid at Lindisfarne in 793, the Viking world kind of exploded onto the scene. They didn't just stop at raiding a few monasteries. Oh no, they started spreading out like wildfire. During the 800s, Vikings pushed out in all directions. From Norway, they went west, hitting Ireland, Scotland, and the islands up north like the Shetlands and Orkneys. From Denmark, they struck into England, France, and even into what we now call Germany. And the Swedes? They turned east, sailing deep into Russia and setting up trade routes all the way to the Byzantine Empire and even the Middle East. One of the biggest Viking hotspots became England. In 865, a massive force known as the Great Heathen Army landed. This wasn't just some raiding party, it was a full invasion. The leaders were brothers, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, sons of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. Their goal? Conquer. And they did just that. They took over huge chunks of English land and even set up a territory called the Danelaw, Viking-controlled land that had its own laws and customs. In Ireland, Vikings founded actual cities, Dublin being the most famous. Modern-day Dublin was originally a Viking town. They used it as a hub for trade, raids, and even slavery. We'll get to that soon. They also built settlements in Iceland and eventually Greenland, led by another big name, Eric the Red. But the Vikings didn't just raid and fight, they traded like crazy. They brought furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves in exchange for silver, spices, silk, and wine. In fact, one of their trade routes went all the way from Sweden down rivers like the Dnieper and Volga, through what would become Kiev and Novgorod, ending up in Constantinople. There, Viking traders, called Varangians, became part of the elite Varangian Guard, personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperor. Meanwhile, in France, Vikings started targeting a place called Paris. In 845, a warlord named Ragnar, yes, possibly the same one from the sagas, led a fleet up the Seine River and attacked Paris. The king, at the time, Charles the Bald, had no choice but to pay him off with 7,000 pounds of silver. That worked for a while. Eventually, another powerful Viking, Rollo, made a deal with the French king in 911. Rollo got land, a whole region that would become Normandy, named after the Northmen, in exchange for protecting the French coast from other Vikings. And yeah, Rollo is the ancestor of William the Conqueror. That means the English royal family is partly descended from Vikings. Wild, right? So by the end of the 9th century, the Vikings weren't just scary raiders anymore. They were rulers, traders, settlers, and explorers. They'd left their mark across half of Europe. And they weren't done yet. All right, time to take a break from all the raiding and sailing and talk about what Viking life was actually like back home. Because, believe it or not, most Vikings weren't warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, fishermen, and traders. The raiding? That was more like a seasonal job, not a full-time gig. Homes and villages. Vikings lived in longhouses, pretty big wooden buildings with thatched or turf roofs. They were long and narrow, hence the name. One family, plus their animals during the cold winters, would all share this space. Imagine your cows hanging out in your living room. Yeah, cozy, but smelly. Inside, the house was centered around a big hearth, fireplace, where people cooked and stayed warm. They didn't have chimneys, so the smoke just rose up and out through holes in the roof. Everyone slept on benches along the walls, wrapped in wool blankets and furs. No privacy, no separate bedrooms, just a big family room, Viking style. Viking villages were small and spread out. Each farmstead was pretty self-sufficient, growing its own crops and raising animals like sheep, goats, and pigs. Communities helped each other, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Food and farming Vikings ate what they could grow or catch. Their diet was actually quite healthy. Lots of fish, especially in coastal areas, meat, bread, porridge, berries, and root vegetables. They made butter, cheese, and drank ale, or mead, a honey-based alcoholic drink. Water wasn't always safe, so even kids drank watered-down ale. They also grew barley, rye, oats, and raised cows for milk. Beekeeping was a thing, too, mostly for making mead. And while it sounds odd today, eating horse meat was normal. In fact, it was connected to their old pagan beliefs. Clothing and style Vikings dressed for function, but they had style, too. Men wore tunics, trousers, and cloaks, while women wore long dresses with apron-like overdresses fastened by brooches on the shoulders. Both men and women liked jewelry, rings, beads, and brooches, often made of bronze, silver, or even gold, if they were lucky. They used combs, tweezers, and ear cleaners. So yeah, Vikings cared about hygiene and appearance. Combs were often found in graves, which shows how important grooming was. Family and society family was everything in Viking culture. Households were usually extended families with grandparents, parents, kids, and sometimes servants or slaves, called thralls. Marriage was more of a partnership. Viking women had more rights than most women in medieval Europe. They could own land, ask for divorce, and run the household while their husbands were away. Honor, loyalty, and reputation were core values. People remembered insults for generations. Feuds could last decades. That's why laws and local assemblies, called things, were so important. They helped solve disputes without bloodshed, at least in theory. Viking society had classes. At the top were the jarls, nobles, then carls, free farmers and workers, and at the bottom, the thralls, slaves. Slavery was a big part of the Viking economy, unfortunately. Captured people from raids were either used for labor or sold at markets. Block 4, Gods, Myths, and Magic. The Viking belief system. Okay, now we're getting into the really fun stuff. Viking religion and mythology. These people didn't just believe in a god or two. They had an entire universe packed with gods, giants, elves, monsters, and magic. Their beliefs shaped how they lived, fought, and even how they died. The Norse cosmos. The Viking universe wasn't like ours. They believed in 9 worlds, all connected by a massive tree called Yggdrasil, the World Tree. At the top of the tree was Asgard, the home of the gods. Midgard, where humans lived, was in the middle. Other worlds included Vanaheim, land of the fertility gods; Jotunheim, home of the giants; Alfheim, land of the light elves; Svartalfheim, realm of the dark elves or dwarves; Niflheim, a cold, misty underworld; Muspelheim, a realm of fire and chaos; Helheim, ruled by Hel, where souls of those who didn't die in battle went. These worlds weren't just metaphors. Vikings believed they were real places you could reach, maybe not physically, but spiritually. Gods and goddesses. The Norse pantheon was split into 2 families, the Aesir and the Vanir. Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and death. He gave up his eye for knowledge and hung himself on Yggdrasil to learn the secrets of the runes. Thor, god of thunder, a mighty warrior who protected Midgard with his hammer Mjolnir. He was super popular among common folk. Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and war. She also received half the warriors who died in battle. The other half went to Odin's Valhalla. Loki, the trickster god. Smart, sneaky, sometimes helpful, sometimes destructive. He's complicated. Tyr, god of justice and law, known for sacrificing his hand to bind the wolf Fenrir. There were many others: Frigg, Odin's wife; Freyr, Freya's brother; Hel, goddess of the underworld, and even animal-like beings. Valhalla and the afterlife. For a Viking warrior, there was no better death than dying in battle. Why? Because that meant you could go to Valhalla, Odin's great hall. There, the bravest warriors, the Einherjar, would fight during the day and feast at night, preparing for the final battle at the end of time. Ragnarok. But not everyone went to Valhalla. Some went to Folkvanger, Freya's hall, others to Helheim, which wasn't hell in the Christian sense, just a place for those who died of illness or old age. Magic, runes, and prophecy magic was real to the Vikings. They had seers called vulvas or seidkonas, women who could tell the future, talk to spirits, and guide communities. Even Odin practiced a form of magic called seder. They also believed in runes. More than just letters, these symbols were thought to carry magical power. Runes were carved into weapons, stones, and even ships for protection or luck. Ragnarok. The end and the beginning. Vikings knew the end was coming, and it had a name: Ragnarok. It was their version of the apocalypse. Here's how it goes. The world falls into chaos. Loki breaks free. Fenrir, the giant wolf, kills Odin. Thor and the serpent, Jormungandr, kill each other. The world is destroyed by fire and water. But here's the twist. It's not the end forever. After Ragnarok, a new world rises. A few gods survive. 2 humans reappear. Life starts again. The cycle continues. So, not all Vikings went west to raid England or settle in Normandy. Some took a very different route, heading east deep into what we now call Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. These guys were mostly Swedes, and they became known as the Varangians. The river routes. The Eastern Vikings traveled by rivers, a whole network of them: the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don. They used these waterways to reach the Black Sea and even the Caspian Sea. They didn't just sail. When rivers got shallow or disconnected, they'd pick up their ships and carry them over land. That's called portage, and yeah, it was rough. Their goal? Trade. And they were good at it. They traded furs, amber, honey, iron tools, and slaves. Sadly, that was a big part of the economy, for silver, silk, spices, and other luxury goods from the east. Along the way, they set up settlements that became important cities, like Novgorod and Kyiv. The Rus, founders of a new power. So, where does Russia come from? Well, Many historians believe that the word Rus came from these Eastern Vikings. According to the 12th century Russian chronicle, the local Slavic tribes invited a Viking chief named Rurik to rule them and bring order. Rurik and his followers came to rule in Ladoga, then Novgorod, around the 860s. Rurik's successors expanded south, and eventually Oleg of Novgorod took control of Kiev in 882. That's the start of Kievan Rus, the first real state in that region. Vikings became princes and rulers, merging with Slavic peoples, adopting their language, culture, and eventually their religion. Later came Prince Igor, then his famous wife Olga, and finally Sviatoslav, a fierce warrior who led campaigns all over the Balkans. And yes, even Vladimir the Great, who Christianized Kievan Rus in 988, had Viking blood. The Varangian Guard, from Sweden to Constantinople. As their journeys continued, many Vikings ended up in Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the great city. It was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, full of riches and wonder. The Byzantines were impressed by these tall, strong, fierce northern warriors and started hiring them as elite mercenaries. Thus was born the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards. These weren't just any soldiers. They were loyal, brutal, and totally fearless. Many of them came from Scandinavia or the Rus, and their presence in Byzantine records shows how far Viking influence reached. There's even graffiti carved by Vikings into the marble walls of Hagia Sophia, the huge church in Constantinople, saying stuff like, "Halfdan was here." Real teenage stuff, even back then. Viking global reach. So, yeah, Vikings weren't just about raiding or colonizing the West. They were part of a global trading network. Their silver came from the Islamic Caliphate, their swords from the Franks, their silk from China. They connected the frozen north to the warm empires of the south. And in the east, instead of disappearing, they blended in, becoming part of new civilizations, new dynasties, and new stories. The edge of the world, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. By the late 800s, the Vikings had already been raiding, trading, and settling across Europe. But for some, it still wasn't enough. Whether they were escaping conflict, chasing adventure, or just looking for new land, they kept pushing west. Way west. Iceland, land of fire and ice. The first major stop was Iceland. Around 870 CE, Norwegians began settling this remote island in the North Atlantic. The land was wild, volcanoes, glaciers, rocky cliffs, but it was empty and fertile enough for sheep, goats, and hardy crops. The most famous early settler was Ingolfur Arnarsson, who, according to legend, threw his high seat pillars into the sea and settled wherever they washed ashore. That place became Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland today. Iceland became more than just a colony. It was a full Viking society with its own rules and traditions. Around 930 CE, they formed the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliaments. No kings, no castles, just chieftains gathering once a year to make laws and settle disputes. Fun fact: Iceland preserved Viking culture and language better than any other place. Even today, modern Icelandic is very close to Old Norse, and many Viking sagas were written down there in the 13th century. Greenland, cold, remote, and risky then, came Greenland. It was discovered and named, a bit dishonestly, by a guy named Eric the Red. He had been exiled from Iceland for killing someone, not unusual in Viking times, and sailed west to explore unknown lands. When he returned, he called it Greenland, to make it sound nice and attract settlers. Classic Viking marketing. Around 985 CE, he led people there, and they set up two main settlements on the southwestern coast. Life in Greenland was harsh, short growing seasons, icy seas, isolation. But they managed for centuries, raising livestock, hunting seals, and even trading with Europe. Eventually, though, the colonies disappeared, likely due to climate change, isolation, and maybe conflict with local Inuit peoples. Eric's son, however, had even bolder plans. Vinland, the Viking discovery of America. Enter Leif Erikson, Eric the Red Sun, and a true explorer. Around the year 1000 CE, Leif sailed further west from Greenland and reached a new land, full of forests, wild grapes, and rich soil. He called it Vinland, Wine Land. Historians believe this was somewhere in modern-day Newfoundland, Canada. Viking sagas describe how Leif and his crew built a small settlement there, known today as Lance aux Meadows, and stayed for a few years. But the new land wasn't empty. They encountered indigenous peoples, called Skraelings in the sagas. At first there was trade, but soon tension and violence broke out. The Vikings weren't able to keep the settlement going and eventually left. Still, this was 500 years before Columbus. The Vikings were the first Europeans to set foot in the Americas, long before the Age of Exploration even began. Why they left so? Why didn't the Vikings keep exploring or colonizing America? Simple. It was too far, too dangerous, and the rewards didn't outweigh the risks. Greenland was already hard enough to maintain, and fighting with local tribes while cut off from reinforcements? Not ideal. But the legacy remained. In the sagas, the ruins, and the fact that Viking ships had crossed the Atlantic before anyone else even dreamed of it. Nothing lasts forever, not even the mighty Viking Age. After centuries of expansion, trade, war, and exploration, the world started to change. And the Vikings? They had to change with it, or fade away. Christianity comes to the north. One of the biggest shifts was religion. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Christianity was spreading fast across Europe and into Scandinavia. At first, most Vikings resisted. Why worship one god when you had Odin, Thor, and Freya? But politics and power changed everything. Harald Bluetooth, king of Denmark, converted to Christianity around 965 CE. He even put up a rune stone saying he brought both Denmark and Norway to the Christian faith. Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, were Norwegian kings who pushed Christianity hard, sometimes literally with swords. Vladimir the Great, the Viking-descended ruler of Kievan Rus, converted in 988 CE and baptized his people. Conversion wasn't always peaceful. Pagan temples were torn down, priests and missionaries were sometimes killed. But over time, the new religion took hold. Old beliefs blended with Christian traditions. Churches replaced longhouses. Crosses replaced hammers of Thor. And slowly, the old gods faded. The rise of stronger kingdoms. Another reason for the Viking Age's decline was political. Europe was getting stronger. Castles were being built. Kingdoms were more organized. The element of surprise, which the Vikings had used so well in the 800s, didn't work as easily anymore. Also, Viking homelands like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden started becoming proper kingdoms with centralized power. Kings wanted stability, trade, and taxes, not wild raiding. In short, the chaos that allowed Vikings to rise was being replaced by order. The last raids and battles. That said, the Viking spirit didn't disappear overnight. Some major events still happened near the end of the era. In 1066, Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, and a legendary warrior, invaded England. He died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, crushed by the forces of Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king. Just 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror, a descendant of Viking settlers in Normandy, invaded England too, and won at the Battle of Hastings. So yes, 1066 is often seen as the official end of the Viking Age. Not because the Vikings vanished, but because they had become part of the system they once raided. What happened to the Vikings? They didn't disappear. They evolved. Many became Christian knights, farmers, traders, or kings. Others were absorbed into the societies they helped build. in England, France, Ireland, Eastern Europe. Their language influenced modern English. Words like sky, egg, and window come from Old Norse. Their genes mixed into local populations. Their ships and tactics shaped naval history for centuries. They stopped being Vikings, which, remember, was a job, not a people, and became Scandinavians, Normans, Russ, and more. So, the Viking Age officially ended almost 1,000 years ago. But somehow, they're more popular today than ever. From TV shows and tattoos to museums and metal bands, Vikings are everywhere. Let's explore why their legacy stuck and how it still shapes our world. The Sagas. Viking storytelling lives. On one of the biggest reasons we know so much about the Vikings today is because of the Icelandic sagas. These are epic stories written mostly in the 13th century about heroes, kings, warriors, and gods. They mix history, myth, and family drama. Some are based on real people, like Egil Skallagrimsson, a brutal poet-warrior. Others, like the Saga of the Volsungs, dive deep into myth and magic. These sagas were written down long after the Viking Age, but they kept the memory alive. They're full of revenge, honor, fate, and epic journeys. And they help turn Viking history into legend. Fun fact, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, was inspired by Norse myths and sagas, especially the names, monsters, and heroic themes. Symbols and style. You've probably seen Viking symbols like the Valknut, a knot of 3 triangles, often linked to Odin and the afterlife. Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, a symbol of strength and protection. Runes, the Old Norse alphabet, used in magic and writing. Today, these symbols are worn as jewelry, printed on clothing, or inked as tattoos. They've become part of a modern identity, not just for Scandinavians, but for people all over the world who feel a connection to Viking spirit, courage, or philosophy. Vikings in pop culture. Let's be real. Vikings are cool. That's why they've made such a big splash in pop culture. Just a few examples. TV shows like Vikings and The Last Kingdom brought their stories to life with drama, battles, and intrigue. Video games like Assassin's Creed, Valhalla let you live the life of a Viking raider. Movies like The Northman and Thor, yes, Marvel's Thor, bring Norse gods and warriors to new audiences. Of course, these aren't always historically accurate. They often blend fact and fiction, but they help spark curiosity and keep the Viking legend alive. Global influence today, you'll find Viking museums, festivals, and reenactments all over the world. In Scandinavia, they're a key part of national history. In the UK, Ireland, France, Russia, and even Canada, their influence is still visible in place, names, traditions, and bloodlines. Even the days of the week reflect Norse mythology. Thursday, Thor's Day, Wednesday, Odin's Day, Woden in Old English, Tuesday, Tyr's Day, Friday, Frigg's Day, and in languages, especially English, we still use Viking loanwords like berserk, husband, knife, law, and slaughter. What the Vikings teach us. In the end, Vikings weren't just raiders or warriors. They were explorers, shipbuilders, poets, farmers, traders, settlers, and innovators. They lived hard lives but left deep marks. They teach us about adaptability, how to survive in harsh lands and constantly changing times. Curiosity, they went further than anyone expected just to see what was out there. Balance, they loved battle but also valued words, honor, and family. Their time may have ended, but their spirit sails on.